I'd like to start by thanking you all for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to share my work with you, and I hope that you'll find it as interesting as I have. I'd also like to acknowledge the music making of the Awabakal people who were here, of course, before colonials arrived and introduced their music making. So I'll explain a little bit why I chose to look at what I am looking at. In the way I'm currently working on a thesis on this, and in the normal way of this kind of PhD work, you start off with one idea and finish with quite another. But during my archival research, which was originally on microfiche but now thankfully is digital, I noted that the mining townships, particularly Wallsend and Lambton, were the most active in their music making and other cultural activities. And so I gradually moved away from looking at music making in Newcastle and visiting performers and other types of events to focusing on the mining communities and their music. What was the music actually doing for them? Why was music so important? Did it help them to recreate themselves in a new and strange environment? Was that part of it? And I think the reason that Johnny said that my work is obscure is because sources are very slender for this period, apart, of course, from the newspapers, which are fantastic sources, but have a certain slant. I might just mention among the newspapers, for those of you who know, the Miners Advocate is quite different to the others and has more of a mining perspective on things, and was produced originally out of Wallsend. So as you can see from my slide, the mining townships were founded very early, early in the 1860s. And I'm looking at the period 1870s, so that sort of goes some way to explain why I'm looking at that period, because by the 1870s those townships were established enough to have cultural activities that were ongoing. And my research is based on 6 local newspapers and more broadly Sydney newspapers, and those are the Maitland Mercury, the Miners Advocate, the Newcastle Pilot, the Newcastle Chronicle, the Northern Times, and the Newcastle Morning Herald. So as many of you probably know, because this is your area too, the 1870s were an important era of the signing of the new agreement between masters and miners in 1874, and then a boom period, with 1875 being the period where with the greatest money to be made by miners. And so therefore we see a great blossoming of cultural activities as well. So what sort of musical activities were going on in the mining townships? Well, there were performing groups like brass bands, minstrel troops and choirs, as well as string bands, which are not so well represented, and individuals such as vocalists and instrumentalists. There's a strong singing tradition coming from nonconformist churches of the migrants, so the main bulk of performers are vocalists. What kind of organisations? There are choral unions with very democratic committees, harmonic societies, mutual improvement societies, and literary societies. What kind of practices? There's concerts inside and outside. There are dance parties that are known as quadrille parties. There's sacred music concerts, benefit concerts for miners who are injured, or for their widows, which was a very important part of community life to support those people. There are minstrel performances, which are a little bit surprising, but very active. People's concerts, an attempt to sort of replicate an English thing of bringing the music to the people. Stedfords, and then more sort of a national, or particularly practices that are associated with identity, like the Stedfords, the Welsh, the Caledonian Games, the Scottish. So I'm going to look at, well, in my thesis I look at brass bands, choral unions, and benefit concerts, but for reasons of time today I'm just going to talk about brass bands and choral unions. And then at the end I'm going to play a little bit of some local compositions, because I couldn't resist that, and I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing something that's not been heard before, except on December the 12th, 2013. So brass bands. Now we all know that Newcastle is a place of excellence for brass bands, and that in the 20th century the Steelworks brass band went to England and won prizes in all the major competitions. So perhaps it's not surprising that miners' brass bands started early. Actually, in Maitland there was a band much earlier, as one reported in 1850, but likely was a mixed band. The first mention of any miners' bands in the Newcastle and Township area is in 1860. And then we get the appearance of the township bands, such as the Waratah, Wallsend, Lambton brass bands, later on the Burwood, Hamilton and Minmai bands. These are slightly different to, I should say the brass band tradition, I don't know how much you already know and I don't want to bore you, but the brass band tradition of course comes from Britain and was a working class musical movement, it's referred to, that just exceeded all expectations and took off in a huge way, serviced in part by new technologies of brass instruments and also by the railway, which allowed people to travel easily. The railway also offering cheap tickets to brass bands in order to get to their next contest. And brass bands, of course, originally were started by the factory owners or the coal mining magnates to provide recreation for and also to boost morale, and were part of the movement called the Movement for Rational Recreation. In other words, anything that wasn't drinking at the pubs. And this was very much the case here too, although here it's the working class who are driving these practices, not the middle class reformers. The difference with the Wallsend and Waratah brass bands and some of the others is that they're township bands, which wasn't so common in Britain. The exception is the Lambton brass band that was sponsored by Thomas Crowders, and that meant that they were very much beholden to him. He was the manager of the Lambton coal mine, and if they left the band, they lost their job, and if they lost the job, they couldn't play in the band, so it was all connected. So what did brass bands do? Well, one of the things that's extraordinary is how ubiquitous they are. They're just at every event. When we start looking through the newspapers, they play outdoors and indoors. They play at parades, excursions, civic events, sports days, flower shows, on railway trains and steamships. So they were everywhere. This is not a picture from here, but it's the right period, it's 1870. I don't know of any photographs from 1870 of brass bands. If you have one, you will be my friend for life. So in order to understand some of this, I've divided them into 4 groups of activities. So entertainment and holiday activities, civic events, processions and parades, and concerts. And I'm just going to illustrate that with a few excerpts from newspapers. So one of the popular ways to spend a holiday was to have a picnic, and these were organised by the miners' unions, the lodges, and the churches, and they often involved an excursion somewhere. And it was essential to have a brass band at these events, partly because people often wanted to engage in some dancing later on. So in 1870, the Newcastle Chronicle reports that a grand orange picnic, which is not to do with colour, in connection with number 26 Loyal Orange Lodge, it will take place at Tomago, and for that purpose the commodious steamer Southland has been engaged and the splendid brass band of the Naval Brigade. They also played at sports days, as I mentioned before, flower shows, and at the races. But some of the anecdotes from the newspapers that are most pleasing are the unexpected visits, the unplanned visits of brass bands to the townships. So we learn that in August 1876, our band paraded the principal streets of the town on Saturday evening and discoursed some of their choicest pieces to the delight and pleasure of the inhabitants. It is a considerable time since we were favoured with a like treat, and as the evening was fine and calm, the music had quite an inspiriting effect. Later in the evening, they rendered some of their best pieces opposite the Protestant Hall, where a concert in aid of the Plattsburgh Public School was being held. I was a little worried when I read that they might be playing at the same time as the concert, which might have been a little bit distracting for the audience, but presumably they weren't. So brass bands, of course, provided the rhythm and the energizing melodies to move to. So marching was an important thing that they could aid with. And so we find brass bands at, obviously at parades, processions, and the annual miners' demonstrations. But a rather telling example is of the Lambton Brass Band on a shopping expedition. This was when, after months of petitioning, the residents of Lambton finally got a train to go from Lambton to Newcastle in order to shop on a Saturday night after work. And it's very local.
Yeah, we're back to petitioning now to get a train to run from Newcastle to Wickham.
And so the Maitland Mercury describes the event. Actually, it was described in several newspapers because it was such a big event. On last Saturday night, the train commenced running from Lambton to Newcastle and back, and was greatly patronised by the inhabitants of Lambton and New Lambton. In fact, the guard van, which was transformed into a ticket office on this occasion, was fairly besieged with men, women and children crushing to get tickets. And it goes on here, I've just got the quote here. In one of the carriages, the fine Lambton Brass Band had its station, and afterwards marched through the town and played some enlivening strains of martial music. They also performed, often performed on the short distance, the short walk from Honeysuckle Station to the new Victoria Theatre when it was opened in 1876. The Newcastle Morning Herald notes in 1876, 5th of October, Lambton Brass Band have very kindly placed their services at the disposal of the committee for this occasion and will march from Honeysuckle Point Station to the theatre, playing appropriate music. There's lots of things like appropriate which leave you completely in the dark as to what they actually played. And a couple of other fun quotes. There's Mr. Hannell going with the brass band, the Lambton Brass Band, to the voting. Unfortunately, the Lambton Brass Band was a bit naughty and they started pulling up the white flags and tossing them around the place. And also, there's also a quote there about the way that the newspaper reinforced the concert series that the band started in the Asylum Gardens. So moving on to the concerts now, which are very interesting. So, of course, the brass bands played at these benefit concerts, which were a frequent part of community life in the townships. But they also occasionally put on their own special outdoor concerts. And during the 1870s, these became more regular. And by mid-1870s, they were performing regularly at the Asylum Gardens, and later in the 1870s at the Crystal Palace Gardens in Waratah. And I made up a table for 1876 because in that year the Newcastle Morning Herald published every second Saturday they played in the gardens, and they published their programme, which was a fantastic resource for seeing what programmes the brass bands played. And a striking thing, which I realise it's rather small, but a striking thing is they always played the same number of items, and they generally started with a march and then went through various dances, sometimes playing a fantasy, which would be a fantasy on an opera, and always finishing with God Save the Queen. And that's commented on by Dave Russell when he writes about brass bands playing in England, that they kept to the same format because it created a sense of familiarity for the audience, and so that they could enjoy it and know where they were in the concert. And I wonder if that also explains why brass bands often played new work by local composers, and that was also welcomed, because we know how resistant people can be to hearing new work. But it was also a regular part of that. Okay. And here is the earliest photograph that does exist of the Waratah Brass Band, which even has the names of the musicians written underneath, so you might find some of your ancestors there. Hawkins, Baker, Morley. Hughes, yes, I think so. Evans, that narrows it down. So, moving on now to choirs, and this is this is the area that I've only been researching recently because I'm up to the chapter about choirs. And I've been amazed at what influence the Welsh had on the singing scene in Newcastle, even though they weren't a large portion of the demographic. Probably the largest portion were the ones from the northeast of England, which had a strong singing tradition, but the Welsh needs a little bit of explaining, of which I will do in a minute, how that came to be. And during the 19th century, it was a century of new traditions in the Hobsbawm idea of invention of new traditions, one of which was, of course, a tradition of brass bands. Another one was a tradition of choirs. And the other one was that Wales was the land of song. This was actually a 19th century invention, and it somewhat changed the view of their neighbours in Scotland and England. Particularly England was very condescending towards the Welsh. So it was a positive development for Welsh identity. And the transformation of the perception of the Welsh, has been attributed to a number of key individuals and factors. Prominent amongst these were harpists and composers who left Wales whilst young to study in London or Europe. And in keeping with Romanticism of the period's interest in folk songs, they started to make collections of Welsh melodies which were hugely popular and successful. And they also recreated these new traditions called Penillion singing, which was the recitation of Welsh poetry to harp accompaniment, and the Eisteddfod. So many people think the Eisteddfod is a very old tradition, but it actually was a 19th century tradition that borrowed some substance from earlier traditions. So not surprisingly, the Welsh Eisteddfod is reported on quite early. I suspect that the Welsh Eisteddfods even started earlier than 1866, but was a very in-house affair and not necessarily written up in the newspapers. So the Welsh Chapel at the Junction, for example, is noted in 1861 when the Newcastle Chronicle praises the singing of the Welsh choir. There were Welsh churches in Wallsend and Lambton, and Thomas Jones, who was a really important musical figure, conducting Sunday school choir and the Lambton Choral Union. Just to quickly to give you a little bit of a view of the Lambton Choral Union. This was founded in 1865 and appears to have been active in the next years, which is a surprising achievement for such a small township when you think Lambton was only really got going in 1863, and in 1865 they already had a choral union. The influence of Welsh singing traditions was much in evidence and no doubt a major factor in such an early formation of a choral society. And the meeting to form the Lambton Choral Society was held in the Welsh Chapel, Lambton, and it would seem likely that the Choral Society drew on the chapel choir for much of its membership. And now I'm just going to give you a little bit of another little vignette, which is about Griffith Jones, who was known as Caradog and became a hero to the Welsh people. He was the man who took the Welsh to success, took the South Wales Choral Union in 1872 and 1873 to Crystal Palace to compete in a London Eisteddfod, and won the coveted, this coveted prize here, and won the love of the Welsh people because the choir was praised so much. And I'll just read you what the Sydney Morning Herald published in 1873 about this event, which is actually borrowed from the Daily Telegraph in London, which will also give you a taste of how the English viewed the Welsh. The time was the 10th of July, the place the central transept of the Crystal Palace, the combatants, but they cannot be described at the fag end of the sentence. Everybody has heard of the national music meetings originated by Mr. Willett Beale, and remembers how last year there came up from South Wales several hundreds of miners, mechanics, and their female belongings, who walked over the course and took back with him the great challenge prize, value 1,000 guineas. This Cambrian invasion made a great hit at the time, and we were all agog with admiration of Taffy's pluck in coming so far for a mere honour, and of the way in which he acquitted himself in an arena where none dared to do him battle. There was no victory to boast of, it is true, but our Welsh neighbours did that which amounted to a phenomenon in London. They showed how it was possible for a band of working men and women, animated by sheer love of music, to travel hundreds of miles at great expense, simply to win a cup, the possession of which necessitated a like sacrifice of time and money 12 months later. There's a really interesting article and goes on with a lot more detail. Now this event was very important to the Welsh community in New South Wales. And the following year, a grand vocal and instrumental concert was given at the Rechabites Hall in Lambton under the auspices of the Lambton Choral Union, calling on the Lambton String Band, the Lambton Brass Band, the Choral Union, and various soloists. And the idea of this event was to raise money to send a testimonial back to Griffith Jones in South Wales. And when I first read that, I found that extraordinary, that they would put aside this time and effort and their own money to pay tribute to this man who probably had, plenty of tributes already. But it shows how important it was to them. So before I move on to just play you a couple of small bits of music, do I have time for that?
We're
I'd
20
like to
minutes
read
now.
you an early letter in 1863, which I find very poignant, to, if I can find it, to the, that was written to the Newcastle Chronicle by a man who signed himself a miner. The object of this was 1863, so from Wallsend, which the mine, I believe, started operating in 1860 or 61. The object of the writer is to bring to the notice of the young men of Wallsend the necessity of forming societies similar to those in vogue in other parts of the colony. Such societies, when based on friendship and harmony, must prove beneficial to any community. A building for a school of arts and mechanics institution has long been talked about, and the sooner it is erected, the better. The Philharmonic Society calls for special attention. I am aware that there are in our midst several young men of promise in the musical line, whose talents, for want of organisation, are entirely lost. Under the management of an able conductor, some entertainment might be got up, which would prove highly remunerative, as well as amusing to all. I am, sir, your obedient servant, a working miner, Plattsburgh, near Wallsend, which gives you an idea of the aspirations of those people. There was a rather condescending and sarcastic rebuttal to that letter, which I won't bother you with now. So just to finish off, because you haven't heard anything, I'll just quickly tell you about some of the local composers. So they were coming up to this period, Edward Fanning and Marmaduke Wilson, who died in 1870 and 1871. Edward Fanning has no surviving compositions, but Marmaduke Wilson has many. Mm-hmm. There were two Germans, Henry Neumann and Franz Becker. Franz Becker was only here for 10 years, but it happens to be the period I'm looking at. And there's a couple of surviving compositions of his, and many others referred to in the newspapers that we don't have. Colin Christie is a better known local person, especially in the electricity line. But he was extremely keen on music and formed orchestras with his abundant number of children. And then there was also Robert Bishop Theobald, who was a teacher, but also composed and published his own music, which has therefore survived. Okay, so these are the kind of covers that were common at that time. So this one by Randolph R. Arndell, who was the only one to actually be born in this area, and who then did the thing of going overseas to study rather than being the one who came in and forged a new life here. And this is a piece of music that I recorded because it's not been heard since whenever, 1876, I suppose. That was Arndell's piece, and as I said, he then went overseas to study. Went first to South Australia, then America, and then London. And this is by Franz Becker, who was a very accomplished musician and who helped the communities a lot to organise their music activities and taught some of the main musicians who then contributed subsequently. And this is a little polka which Johnny DeGravio helped me to find out. It was written for a specific, about a specific villa called the Myrtle Villa, which is in
Newcastle.
We both have the same quality. The Hill, wasn't it?
It's in the hill, yeah.
Yes.
It's on the hill.
Yeah.
Have you heard of it, Keith? Myrtle Villa? Have you heard of Myrtle Villa?
No.
It was dedicated to W.K. Lockhead, Esquire. So this is a polka. I'm just starting from there, if there's one music. So that's all, folks. I'm really happy to take questions if that's great. I should say that I find it really sad that a lot of that music is lost. So if anybody knows of anybody who's got music that goes back through their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Yes?
You said that Becca was only here for 10 years?
Yes, that's right.
Did he die or he left?
Oh no, he moved to Queensland. Went first to Charters Towers and then on to Bundaberg, where he wrote more compositions, of which one survives. And he had a family up there. But he's a bit shrouded in mystery because even on that piece it says Herr Becker RAM, which stands for Royal Academy of Music, but you know where, which Royal Academy of Music there are many. So.
I was just wondering if there's any record of opera or ballet or GNS before 1880, and I'm thinking the Victoria Theatre, which was the current one was built in 1891, I think, but there was an earlier one which I presume had that sort of had concerts and things as well.
1876, yes. It mainly put on these huge, spectacular variety shows featuring some of these people who were really good at doing impersonations and characters. Like Little Nell was the first act. I don't know if she was still a child at that point. And then they had prairie, sort of Buffalo Bill scenes and trains and smoke. When he did try to put on some Shakespeare, that was a bit of a flop. Because they were relying on the great bulk of the population who were miners to come and pay money to see things. So they might have aimed a bit too high with Shakespeare. People weren't familiar with it. But I'm not saying there's anything in it innately. It's just if you're not familiar with Shakespeare, then it's just strange to you. But later on, GNS was alive and well in the 1890s, and there was a Charlestown Juvenile group that performed GNS, and a couple of photographs by Snowball.
There was also a military band up here called the Northern Regiment Band, or the 4th New South Wales Infantry Regiment Band. I'm not sure if it predates 1880 or post-dates. I've got a very, very poor quality photo of it, very bad in Fox. But
oh, okay. I'd love to see that.
It's certainly that regiment. You could probably find out from Bill Storer's book about when the various regiments were formed up here. It's not a very old book. A couple of years ago he produced it. It may just predate 1880, but certainly they had a band. And the photograph shows some kids in the band. It would only be about 12, 13, 14, so it must have been ringings to sort of make up the complement. But it certainly existed.
The ones in this period that I read about are the Newcastle Volunteer Artillery Band, which often was called by different names, and the Naval Brigade Band. Those are the two that crop up all the time. So, sure. But yours might even be earlier, who knows? Yeah. Somebody else. Yeah.
The Scottish and the Welsh got a mention,
Yes.
but the Irish and the Cornish seem to have missed out.
Yes.
Is that because the newspapers didn't report them, or they didn't exist? Or
I don't know much about the Cornish, but the Irish, of course, they were much less strongly represented than the rest of New South Wales. They were a small portion of the demographic, but they still had their St Patrick's Day celebrations. There were Irish concerts. There were locally produced Irish concerts, but there also were visiting entertainers who gave Irish concerts. But I think it was to do with numbers, really. And the Protestants were definitely the dominant group, so they had their orange parades and Protestant celebrations whilst espousing democracy. They knew they were the best. I don't know about the Cornish, maybe somebody can help.
Russell and then Marilla. Russell and then Marilla. Yes.
The sheet music you showed there, the publishers were, one of them was West Maitland and Sydney, the other one was Wallara and London.
So observant.
And 4 shillings and I think 2 shillings and sixpence, so it was quite expensive, would have been quite expensive for the time. How widely did it get distributed? So Becca's music would have been done for here, but how widely around Australia would it have been sold?
I'm not sure if I know the answer to that question. If it had been sold very widely, then probably more of his music would have survived.
It was the second edition.
Yeah, well, that one and Love's Philosophy are the 2 works that did survive and that are known of. There was a great appetite for music at that time because it was the main form of entertainment. So they may well have, at least it was known in New South Wales, but I couldn't really tell you. I suppose looking in state libraries gives you a clue.
Yeah, well,
they're the New South Wales ones which hold it. Yeah. Some music was produced locally, as you mentioned, at Maitland, and Randolph produced his in Newcastle. So they were always advertised in the newspapers as well, so people knew that they were there and available to be bought. Yeah. Not something I've looked at so much though, so food for thought.
Okay, Marilla last.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry, my voice is a bit gone. I think your period falls within the time of great sectarian divide between the Protestants and the Irish Catholics of Australia, because there was a huge Irish musical tradition, especially through the liturgy of the church itself, but also in their denominational schools. And they were quite an exclusive set of education systems. There was the state one and there was the denominational Roman Catholic one, in which music flourished and in which their pupils, in fact, scored brilliantly and in vast numbers in the conservatorium exams and things that went on, and the British Trinity College London exams. So there was a very strong Irish tradition, but it was quite separate, I think, from the British one.
Yeah, I haven't noticed.
I don't know about bands, though. I do know about choirs and things.
Oh, right, well, I'll talk to you. I haven't noticed any advertisements for Roman Catholic schools in this period, though, so I don't know if they've got going a bit later.
Okay, Peter.
The Cornish miners were brought out in the 1860s for the settlement of Adamstown, the development of Adamstown in the late 1860s. But separate from that, did you come across any cross-fertilisation between performers in the maritime industry, passenger vessels or visiting vessels, and then topping that off in January of 1888, the Tsar's cousin came in a new man of war. They brought their own brass band with them, and it performed at various ceremonies around Newcastle. That's a little bit later.
Right. I haven't come across any. There's a report of visitors like Saul Samuel when he arrives, the General Postmaster, and the welcome on the wharf. And I can't remember. I know the brass band played at some point, and of course brass bands played on the excursion steamships. But I just don't know if they played on the others. I haven't found anything about that, which doesn't mean it didn't happen. But I should say that one of the endearing things about this period is actually, you're talking about all these different ethnic groups, but actually they did work together a lot. And even though there was this Protestant superiority thing, the Lambton Brass Band played to raise money for the Roman Catholic Church. They all worked together. in a surprising way, perhaps because they were a new community that we could probably learn from today. And so that's been one of the nice things that I've discovered.
Even in Belfast, the local, not the Orange Lodge, but the Masonic Lodge, they helped to organise money for St Patrick's Cathedral. So even, and you know, the trouble that obviously ensued up there tended to be seasonal. So there's still, you know, cooperation even then.
On that cooperative note, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Helen.